I talked about how biology influences behavior, but we can't assume, or it's not true that biology is the only thing that influences gender. There's definitely social influences and culture that are going to influence gender as well, and so I definitely want to talk about these as well. Okay, so the primary social influence on gender is the family. So how masculine you feel, how feminine you feel, the stereotypes in which you hold about men and women, how much you believe that gender bending can happen, meaning that men can wear pink or girls can wear boy jeans, or now boys are wearing, girls jeans, skinny jeans. So how much you believe that is okay, as well as how much you feel that you're a man or a woman and whatnot, all of those tend to be mostly influenced, or at least the primary influence is family. We also find, though, your siblings make a difference. So children who have older siblings that are the same sex tend to be more gender typical than children who have opposite sex older siblings. And so this can be for a couple of reasons. One is that many times the younger child gets hand-me-downs. So if you have a same-sex older sibling, then they're probably already developed their gender identity, and so maybe at the beginning the parents were trying to be more gender neutral, and say you had a little boy, and they decided, well, we're going to give the little boy Richter sets and whatnot, but we're also going to give him a Barbie or something. And once that little boy rejected it, the second child, the younger sibling, who's now a boy, also might be less likely to get those things, because they're now getting the hand-me-downs. And that little boy rejected it, so why is it going to get passed down to the younger? Also, we find that children with opposite sex siblings, if they want to play with their older brother or sister, their older opposite sex sibling, many times they have to do the games that the older sibling likes, and therefore, again, they're going to have to bend their idea of play to be more gender neutral, or even more on the opposite end. So for example, a little boy who has an older sister, maybe she's really into tea parties. Well, that little boy, if he wants to play with his older sister, is going to have to play tea party, and he might not have played tea party if he didn't have an older sister. Okay, so does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Again, and then also you just have to know that imitation and rewards and punishments are going to influence gender behavior. So the imitation is what I was kind of talking about with the same-sex older siblings. You're likely to imitate your sibling. So if your sibling is the same sex, then maybe you'll be more gender typical. And if your sibling's older sex, your older sibling is opposite sex, then you might imitate them, which would make you less gender typical. But also the rewards and punishments. So for example, I'll give another example of my own. I remember I went to a school that was really into football, and so they would get these kids into football even at like 6 and 7 years of age, maybe even younger. But there was this one little boy who was 6 years old, and he wanted to play on the football team, and he did. And when he hit the other little boy, he got hurt, and he came out and he started crying. And I remember his father was there, and his father really put him down in a sense, tried to tell him, boys don't cry, you should try not to cry, don't cry. And so what he was doing there is he was punishing his behavior, right? That a boy is not able to cry, and therefore, in his idea now of what men are, one of those things is going to be that men are not allowed to cry. And so that would be one way. Or, to reward a behavior, if your child does something that's considered uber masculine and it's a boy, and you like that, then you reward it by giving them more praise or being more happy about it. Okay. But I do want to say, some people believe that gender has absolutely no biological basis, that all of gender is socialized. And so if you were to, for example, raise a young girl as a boy, that she would very, happily live as a boy for the rest of her life, because everything about gender is socially based. So I want to give you guys the study of David Reimer. And it really shows that gender is not exclusively learned at all. So David Reimer was a twin, and so when he was a young little boy, him and his brother, within the first 10 days of being alive, were circumcised. And for an unfortunate reason, David Reamer, his circumcision went wrong, and they actually cut off a portion of his penis. At this time, there were lots of people who believed that gender was completely socially influenced and had no biological basis at all. And so this psychologist named Dr. Money, or Mooney, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it looks like money, he had said, you know, I think that you should raise this little boy as a girl. I think we should take off the rest of his genitalia and raise this child as a little girl. Now, of course, that probably sounds crazy to most of you, but you have to think, if you have a psychologist who seems very educated and smart and is telling you that this is the best thing to do, you'd probably try it. And so that's what the parents did. So they changed this young boy's genitalia to look much more like a female, and they raised this child as a little girl. And here are the pictures of him in this slide. And as you can see, this is actually to the left here. This is a book that was written after this happened. At this point, they named they named this child Brenda. And here you can see Brenda looks really adorable. And so Mooney had wrote this book basically saying, look, I'm right, gender is completely socialized, and this little boy is now being raised as a girl and is doing it successfully. And she looks like a cute little girl. And everything looked like it was going great, but you have to remember this child at this point is probably 2 or 3 on the picture to the left, and maybe 4 or 5, possibly 6 at oldest, on the right. They're not accounting for a big life-changing situation that's coming up, which is puberty. And so when puberty hit, Brenda did not exactly look the same. So here's Brenda at around, I think, 13 or 14, and you can see Brenda here is to the right. And this is her twin brother. I don't know his name, I'm sorry. But as you can see with this picture, she no longer looks that feminine, right? She looks very tomboyish. She's not a particularly attractive woman or girl. Not particularly unattractive either, but she's not, her gender identity, or at least I should say gender roles, she's not looking very feminine, right? And so what happened was, of course, she had to go to lots of doctor's visits, and her parents didn't tell her why, mainly because Dr. Mooney had said, you should, you know, to fully believe this, you guys should forget about what happened. You should not tell Brenda about this story, because then she's going to question her gender and her gender identity. So it's best to just stick with the story that she's been a woman her whole life, she's female, and, you know, no one has to know the better. Well, she was going in for, of course, treatments, medications to try to stop the androgen exposure that was going to happen during puberty. And so one day she went to her parents, and they had told her that she had to have another surgery and more medication. And she said to them, I refuse to do this. I want to know why. I feel like you guys are hiding something from me. And I will not go to another surgery until you tell me what's going on. Well, the parents did decide to tell her, and so they told her that she was actually born a boy. And you might think that she was full of rage and anger and disappointment, but believe it or not, Brenda said that she felt relieved, that she always knew that she was not a girl. She always knew she was a boy, and she actually felt relief to be confirmed this, right? So her gender identity was very masculine. She felt very male. And actually her biology confirmed it, right? She was male. But the social influences was not enough to get her to not feel male. So what happened? She turned back into a man. This is David Reamer in the last few years, I think in the 90s. And he got married and had children. And when I took my human sexuality class a few years back, it was shown as a success story that he transitioned back, and that, you know, of course, obviously, that he was not, that gender was not socially constructed, that there were very obvious biological aspects to one's behavior. and feeling gender, a feeling of gender. But then, unfortunately, a few years back, he actually committed suicide after his wife left him. And I believe in the suicide note, he wrote something to the effect of, let this be shown that this experiment failed miserably, right? That him trying to be raised as a girl failed miserably. And it wasn't just that it failed, as a child, that he, felt awful being a girl and never felt like a girl, but even in adulthood, that he had suffered from depression his whole life, that he had suffered from all of these issues. And therefore, it wasn't just that this affected his childhood, that it affected his entire life. Okay, that's the story of David Reimer. Now, this is different, of course, than transgendered people in the sense that David Reimer, his gender identity was actually consistent with his sex, right? He was a boy. Yes, he was changed to be a girl, but his biology was male, and so his gender identity matched his biology. Transgendered people have a gender identity that does not match their biology. It does not match their sex. So, one way in which you can call this is gender dysphoria. And this is a clinical term, and it's the unhappiness that is caused by the discordance between the biological sex and the gender identity, right? So transgendered people typically experience gender dysphoria because they do not feel like their biological sex is the same as their gender identity. So another way to say that is they possess the anatomy of one sex, but the gender identity of the opposite sex. And again, transgendered people exist in various cultures. Why do I bring that up? Just to hammer this home, that it seems to be more biologically based or evolutionary based than socially constructed. Transgendered people, there are female to male transsexuals, or another way to call them is trans men. There are male to female transsexuals, and these are trans women. Okay, so here on the top is, these are trans women, right? So they were born male and now they are female. And this is in, I believe, Thailand. And in Thailand, there are quite a few transgendered women, and they're considered very beautiful. They're actually some of the most beautiful people in the culture. And below, these are the Greeks, and these are actually the Amazon women on the horses. And what's interesting is typically Amazon women were not, or women were not allowed to ride horses, and so they have typical male hairstyles in this. So it's the idea that these were males, but somehow, possessed women's bodies. So just another example of kind of transgendered people in various cultures. Okay, so as I said, female to male transsexuals or trans men are people who were born female and then changed to males, right? And the reason why we call them trans men is that, of course, it's respectful to call them by the identity in which they feel they are, right? So you wouldn't call this person a female because they don't feel female, they feel male, and therefore, as a respect to their gender identity, you would call them by the identity in which they feel they have. Same with male to female transsexual. These are trans women. Now, there has been some research done specifically on male to female transsexuals, and there seems to be two types of transsexuals, what's called classical and then autogynephilic. Now, classical are transsexual transsexual women who felt even at a very young age that they were in the wrong body, right? So at a very young age, they did not want to be male, and then typically they change at an earlier age, right? So they might have a more successful transition. Now, autogynephilics, this is actually a very political stance right now, and a lot of people in the trans community do not appreciate this label. However, there has been a lot of science done and dedicated to it. So if you actually break down the word autogynephilia, Philia lets you know that it's going to be a fetish of sorts, right? Auto is self, and gyno, if you think about it, we know of OBGYNs or gynecologists. It actually means female anatomy. So autogynephilia means that you have um, an attraction to yourself as a woman. Right? So these all have to be males, born males. And so what happens is that they are actually more attracted to themselves as a woman than feeling like a woman. And so it actually is almost like a very extreme version of a fetish, right? And so typically this tends to happen at puberty. So these individuals they might be a little gender deviant as children, but they don't typically feel like they want to change into being a woman until puberty. And so what might happen is at first they get aroused by wearing women's clothing, right? And so they don't necessarily want to be a woman yet, but they do like wearing women's clothing. And then that just it escalates until they're at a point where they're actually sexually attracted to themselves as women. And so those are the big differences between what are called classical transsexuals and autogynephilics, but I must say that this is still highly political in the field, and that there are many people who disagree with this. But there is a lot of science dedicated to this kind of research, and it'd be an interesting paper for anybody who wants to write about autogynephilia or just the differences between classical and autogynephilic transsexuals. Okay, and then related, although not exactly the same, is transvestism. And again, this is that idea of the erotic value of wearing clothing of the opposite sex. So these are individuals who aren't as extreme as the autogynephiles. So they like wearing the other sex's clothing, but their identity is still very much consistent with their sex. So again, typically these are men. So men who get aroused when they wear women's clothing. However, they don't ever want to be a woman. They just get aroused wearing women's clothing. And again, that is different than just cross-dressing in general. So sometimes people will cross-dress to be funny, to even on Halloween or just whatnot, and they're not getting erotic value from it. So just because someone cross-dresses, or again, you can go to a lot of shows in which men dress as women, they're not necessarily transvestites or have a transvestism because they aren't getting erotic value from it. Okay, so some, but not all transsexuals get sex reassignment. So a lot of people assume that they do, but there are many transsexuals that just never make it to actually changing their genitals, and they have no desire to. But if they wanted to, the standards that are suggested by the World Professional Association for Transgendered Health is that they think that you should have psychological and physical evaluations. And these are incredibly intense. So they want to make sure that these people don't have something else going on in which makes them want to change sexes. So, for example, in I believe it's in Iran, they feel that homosexuality is a sin. However, if you change your sex, then therefore it's no longer a sin. So sometimes gay men will try to get sex reassignment surgeries so that they can live as women, so that they can then have sex with men without fear of being, stoned or killed or just ridiculed. So they would, hopefully you would go through the psych evaluation and see that this person doesn't actually feel like they want to be a woman, more so that they just are gay. They want to have sex with men. Okay, once the psych eval goes through, then they actually want real life experience as living with the other sex. So they ask these individuals to live in the community for 1 or 2 years as the opposite sex, as the sex that they desire, before they have the surgery, so that they feel what it feels like to go through that transition. And many times these individuals still have therapy during this time because it's a very tough transition. Again, imagine that you are, at work and you have this man who you've worked with for 6 months or a year or 5 years, and all of a sudden one day he comes back in and he's starting to look more and more feminine, and he comes in as a dress and comes in with a dress and asks that you refer to him instead of Bob as Brenda. It's hard for that individual because many people reject that and say, no, I know you as Bob, or this is ridiculous or silly. So they have them go through this before making the big change to say, okay, do you really want to do this? And then they give them hormone treatment, androgen blockers, and estrogen for the men, and of course testosterone pills and estrogen blockers for the women, or the females turning to males. And then, like I said, some of them, but not all of them, opt to have sex reassignment surgery. So for the vulva, what they do is they make the clitoris from the top surface of the foreskin. So, of course, these are men who are getting sex reassignment surgeries to become women. So they actually take the foreskin, or the gland of the penis, the front of the penis, and fashion it into a clitoris. They take the labia tissue from the mucosa of the penile urethra, so the inside of the urethra. And then what they do is they actually take the penis and invert it. They put it inward so that it can act somewhat like a vagina. And they actually need to lengthen it daily to keep it from shrinking. So male to female transsexuals typically have a device that they have to stick inside of their, fashioned vagina so that it can keep it from shrinking. Okay. Now, and there's pictures of this in the book, so I suggest you guys go look if you want to see what it looks like. So for female to male transsexuals, it's actually there's a couple of options. It's a little more difficult. So most of them will go through what's called hormone treatment. This is just simpler and less invasive. So what they do is they use the hormone treatment and to give testosterone and whatnot, so that it actually can lengthen the clitoris. So the clitoris lengthens out only a couple inches, but then it can fashion to look a little bit like a penis. Now, it's not necessarily all that functional, but it gives them the feeling of a penis without having to cut into any tissue. So, however, you can also actually, they can actually create a penis if you want one that looks more like a penis. If the female to male transsexual wants something that looks more like a penis, then they can actually, use more tissue and relocate the clitoral tissue to be at the head of the penis. But they might lose sensation and not be able to orgasm after that, which is why a lot of these male to female transsexuals don't opt to do that. And then, of course, you can have testicular implants, and they would actually implant them into the labia majora, so that it looks much more like a penis as well. So again, look in the book. There are pictures of this, and it's very interesting. And I don't know if I said, but for the male to female transsexual, the trans women, after doing these post-ops, they actually may reach orgasm still as well. So orgasms might be more difficult, but by no means impossible. Okay, that concludes Chapter 7.